Hello, I'm Esther Githui. Welcome to Africa 54. Here's what's coming up. Despite international calls for a ceasefire, Israel is pressing ahead with its air and ground offensive against Hamas. Boosted by unwavering support from the United States and a visit from U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, Israeli forces raided one of the last functioning hospitals in Gaza's north. Israel's assault on Gaza, launched in response to Hamas' October 7th attack into Israel, has killed nearly 20,000 Palestinians and displaced almost 2 million people. The United Nations Security Council is expected to vote on the situation in the Middle East Tuesday. The UN Security Council delayed their vote on an Arab-sponsored resolution Monday. Israeli airstrikes overnight killed at least 28 people in Gaza's southern city of Rafah, including women and children. Their bodies were brought to 2 hospitals in the city, according to the Associated Press. 25 bodies of those killed in one strike that hit a house were brought to the Kuwaiti hospital in Rafah. Most of the dead were from one family, but among them were also displaced people who were sheltering there, according to an Associated Press journalist at the hospital. Another strike killed at least 3 people whose bodies were taken to a different hospital. During his visit to Israel Monday, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin reaffirmed his country's unshakable support to the Jewish state. He also emphasized the importance of protecting Palestinian civilians and reaching a 2-state solution after the war ends. VOA's Veronica Balderas Iglesias has the details.
Injured in Israeli airstrikes, Palestinian children were rushed to hospitals Monday in Gaza. The same day, Human Rights Watch accused Israel of blocking Palestinians' access to water and using starvation as a weapon in the Gaza Strip. Tel Aviv rejected the accusations, calling them anti-Semitic. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who met with several Israeli officials on Monday, including his counterpart Yoav Gallant, said protecting Palestinian civilians in Gaza was a moral duty and a strategic imperative.
Democracies are stronger and more secure when we uphold the law of war. We will continue to stand up for Israel's bedrock right to defend itself. And we will also continue to urge the protection of civilians during conflict and to increase the flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza.
Gallant affirmed that his forces aim to minimize harm to the civilian population as Israel pursued its goal to destroy Hamas, a militant group that launched the deadly October 7th terrorist attack inside Israel, killing 1,200 people and taking some hostage.
We are defending our values and we operate according to international law. Yet, anytime we discuss humanitarian issues, we must remember the 129 hostages we held in Gaza. This is the most humanitarian issue.
While warning the Lebanon-based militia Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies to avoid escalating the conflict in the region, Austin and Gallant laid out their visions for the post-war era in the Palestinian territories.
We know that the past 72 days have been some of the most painful days in Israel's history. But it would compound this tragedy if all that was waiting for the Israeli people and your Palestinian neighbors at the end of this awful war was more insecurity, fury, and despair. But it is in the interest of both Israelis and Palestinians to move forward toward 2 states, living side by side in mutual security.
We know that Hamas will not control Gaza. Israel will not control Gaza in any civilian way. We will conduct any needed operational and military effort in order to secure our future. And we are building the routes for non-hostile partners in the other side.
For Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Mohammed Shtaya, however, the priority is an immediate end to the war.
This world must help us to stop the aggression and end the occupation. The Palestinian leadership is not tailored to anyone. Its legitimacy comes from its people, and the voice of the people is in the ballot box.
The U.S. efforts to help stabilize the Middle East will continue this week, with Defense Secretary Austin expected to hold several meetings in Bahrain and Qatar. Veronica Valderas Iglesias, VOA News, Washington.
Now to Sudan, where the International Organization for Migration says at least 250,000 to 300,000 people have fled the Gezira state since December 15th as a result of clashes between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese army. The RSF, at war with the army for the past 8 months, has been advancing on Gezira state capital, Wad Madani, and witnesses say its fighters entered the city on Monday. Shelters in Port Sudan are struggling to accommodate the large influx of refugees amid severe shortage of supplies. Many displaced people have fled to Port Sudan, where the situation is more stable as the city is not under the direct influence of the conflict. A shelter north of Port Sudan, established by local humanitarian agencies, currently houses nearly 500 people from more than 100 families across the country. As the fighting between the Sudanese army and the Rapid Support Forces continues, the UN World Food Programme warns the situation is likely to get worse, especially if the warring parties do not pause to allow for humanitarian assistance. For more on the hunger facing civilians trapped in the fighting, I'm joined live from Nairobi, Kenya by Lenny Kinsley, the World Food Programme spokesperson for Sudan. Lenny, thank you for joining us on Africa 54.
Thank you so much for having me and for covering this important crisis.
Now, which parts of Sudan are facing high risk of hunger, and what are you doing to reach civilians?
So the parts of Sudan that are facing the highest levels of hunger are where active fighting is ongoing. In Khartoum, Sudan's capital, in the Darfur region, and now we are very concerned that the fighting has spilled over into Wad Madani, Gezira state, a state that was previously Sudan's breadbasket. And we are seeing levels of hunger that are unforeseen in what is currently the harvest season, where there is more food availability. And in the coming months, when the lean season hits and people run out of their food stocks, then we could see catastrophic levels of hunger, especially in these conflict hotspots.
And how many people are we talking about? Which people, how many would you say are food insecure at this point?
So a newly released food analysis by the Integrated Phase Classification shows that nearly 18 million people are facing acute hunger across Sudan. That's the entire population of the Netherlands. It is a huge number of people. And as I mentioned before, what is so concerning about this, these are the numbers that we are seeing in a time period where food is usually more available, and we should be seeing a decrease in food insecurity. And as the conflict continues and now spreads into Sudan's breadbasket, Gezira state, and pushing further south and east of Khartoum, this is only going to exacerbate a situation that has already been so horrific for millions of civilians who are bearing the brunt of this conflict.
Mm-hmm. So now, what options do you have as WFP and other humanitarian organizations to reach those people that are staring at starvation?
So we have managed to open up a cross-border operation to Darfur, which is in Sudan's west, from Chad. So through that, we have had almost 10 or more than 10 aid convoys go through, where we have supported more than 500,000 people in western and central Darfur. And these are the options that we have, is to negotiate access and to keep calling for access so that we can reach these extremely vulnerable people in areas where they are either trapped by conflict or cannot afford to buy a bus ticket or fuel to get out. And so we are other UN agencies like the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs to negotiate access. But in the end, this conflict has to end as soon as possible for the sake of the people on ground that we see on the screen here, many of whom are now fleeing for the second time, having abandoned and having to have run from their homes in Khartoum and now fleeing on foot with little or nothing.
Wow, what a dire situation there. Lenny, many thanks for talking to us on The Voice of America. Lenny Kinsley is the World Food Programme spokesperson for Sudan. It's been 1 year since African leaders gathered in Washington for the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. The summit focused on developing economic and strategic partnerships between the United States and African countries, boosting Africa's position in the global economy, promoting innovation and entrepreneurship. VOA's Paul Ndiho interviewed Michael Jordan, Prosper Africa's Chief of Staff, and they talked about significant strides made by the United States in trade and investment.
Prosper Africa exists to boost two-way trade and investment. We help U.S. companies get into Africa. We help African companies to grow and connect with U.S. companies. We're the connective tissue. We want to build a strong conduit between the two geographies so that for mutual benefit.
It's been a year since the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. Bring us up to speed. What has Prosper Africa been up to?
Well, Prosper Africa was created to increase two-way trade and investment between the United States and the entire African continent. We've made tremendous progress on boosting trade, on boosting investment, on incentivizing the private sector, and on mobilizing finance for African business. I can cite one example that since the ALS last year, we've closed 547 transactions worth $14.2 billion. This is an increase of about 67% over the year before. And it really demonstrates how we've redoubled our efforts across the United States government to engage with Africa, to invest and to trade in a meaningful way.
When you talk about some of the contracts that have been closed, highlight some of those areas of investment.
Well, these areas of investment range the gamut of sectors, and this is because it's private sector driven. We have deals in energy, in aviation, in healthcare, in agriculture. We've incentivized over the last year or been part of $242 million of exports from the continent to the United States, helping to utilize the AGOA mechanism.
When I've talked to a lot of people on the continent, they seem to suggest that the U.S., despite these commitments, the U.S. is not doing enough. They need more dollars invested in Africa. How would you respond to those people in Africa who say this is like a drop in the ocean?
Public sector resources, whether they're from any part of the globe, will have a limited impact because the investment needs on the continent are so great. In infrastructure alone, the African Development Bank estimates that $100 billion of investment is needed just to fill the infrastructure gap on a continual basis. What we focus on is stimulating the private sector. And sometimes you'll see the private sector doing something and you would not know that Prosper Africa, that the US government is supporting that particular business. But we believe that the multiplier effect that we can achieve through stimulating and incentivizing private investment will have an even greater impact than anything that will come from the public sector.
There are some countries that have taken advantage of the opportunities that Prosper Africa offers in terms of investment and trade.
We've seen African companies take an interest in investing and having a presence in the United States. We have banks like United Bank for Africa, Rand Merchant Bank, I understand, opened a branch in New York earlier this year. Investments that complement and seem to enlarge and provide opportunities for African businesses to do more trade or more investment or more financing activities. We've seen that sort of proliferate over the last decade or so.
That was Michael Jordan, Prosper Africa's Chief of Staff, speaking to VOA's Paul Ndiho. Let us know what you think about Africa 54 and all our VOA Africa programs on our website at voaafrica.com. Still to come, in our health report, understanding menopause and andropause. We'll be right back.
This week on Straight Talk Africa. Sudan erupted into chaos after fighting exploded in April between General Abdel Fattah Burhan and General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo in the capital Khartoum and across the country. Join me, Heidi Adams, and my guests as we revisit the war in Sudan on the next Straight Talk Africa.
In other news, Morocco's tourism industry is having a banner year. Tourism Minister Fatim Zahra Amor says all signs point toward hitting the 14 million visitors milestone by the end of the year. Tourism is boosting the wider economy despite September's earthquake and accounts for 7% of Morocco's gross domestic product and is a key source of foreign currency. Burkina Faso's military leaders are accusing jihadist groups of committing massacres against civilians in the north. The military is urging the population not to believe videos circulating on social media since the start of December, accusing the army of committing acts of violence against civilians in the northern Djibo area. And Kenya and the European Union are closer to sealing an economic partnership agreement that will grant the East African nations exports duty-free status and unlimited access to the bloc. The deal has been approved by the European Union and it will now be presented to the parliaments of both sides for ratification before it comes into force. As Senegal gears up for elections in February, some reporters are turning away from coverage, citing attacks and threats. However, some journalists and police are training together to find a better way forward. Senanu Todd reports from Dakar, Senegal.
At the Maison de la Presse in Dakar, Senegal, journalists share their experiences of harassment by police and politicians with media stakeholders and security experts. They say violations in the past 2 years are responsible for Senegal's ranking on the Press Freedom Index, dropping from 49th to 104th of 180 countries. Coverage of protests over the arrest of an opposition leader in 2021 marks the beginning of the decline, says Mamadou Thio, chair of Senegal's Council for the Observation of the Rules of Ethics and Professional Conduct in the Media, or CORED. Media covering those clashes, in which about a dozen civilians were killed, soon found themselves targeted.
The journalists wanted to show what was happening really, and this, police and gendarmerie forces didn't want the press to show that, and that's why, sometimes there was daggers drawn. The gentleman agreement existing between us, let's say before March 21, this gentleman agreement, did not operate it after those events.
Since that date, media watchdogs have documented upward of 20 assaults on journalists.
One of the attacks happened recently and I find it very ridiculous. During a protest, the governor, specifically a former governor of Dakar, gave blatant instructions to the defense and security forces to tear gas and attack the press.
VOA's attempt to reach Governor Alioune Badara San about the incident were unsuccessful. A spokesperson for Senegal's government did not respond to VOA's request for comment about the incident and the country's decline in press freedom. In a bid to repair the relationship, police and press are training together. In a training session hosted by RSF, journalists called for increased protection and reform to several provisions in Senegal's press code.
We are calling on the authorities, first of all, to put an end to the never-ending hours of journalists we have seen the last 2 years, and also to repeal the problematic provisions in the press codes, because in many countries in West Africa, the press codes are done in a way that if a journalist is arrested, he can't be sent to jail directly. But in Senegal, that's not the case.
As Senegal's February presidential election approached, Reporters Without Borders, or RSF, has observed an increase in harassment. The media watchdog has noted a rise in intermittent internet cuts and social media blackouts as well. Sabah Abbas says these are attempts to silence the media.
I don't think our country, which always claims to be a democratic and hospitable country, should be called a democratic one if we continue to see these kinds of practices, if journalists can no longer do their job properly.
While Courage says many journalists are wary of political coverage ahead of the February vote, RSF says it will be there to help train and equip reporters to do their work safely. Senan Lutod, VOA News, Dakar, Senegal.
Now, according to National Institute of Aging, aging is an inevitable and natural process that brings about a series of physiological changes in both men and women. VOA Health reporter Mkamiti Kibayasi has the details. Hello, Mkamiti.
Hello, Esther. Two significant events associated with aging are menopause and andropause. To understand the health challenges and at what age this condition occurs, as well as how to cope with these changes, physical changes that every human being experiences, I am joined by Dr. George Gwako, a gynecologist at Galax Gynocare in Nairobi, Kenya. Dr. Gwako, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you, Mkamati, for having me. Always a pleasure to come back.
Thanks. Explain to us the difference between menopause and andropause.
Now, menopause basically refers to the final menstrual period, which occurs around 51 years of age. The range is between 55 and 55 years of age. Clinically, we diagnose it when a lady who is more than 45 years of age has 12 consecutive months of no menses. Andropause, on the other hand, quite controversial to be honest, is the gradual decline in testosterone levels, which starts at around age 40. Now, for a small percentage of men, the decline in testosterone levels is significant enough to cause clinical symptoms. And then at that point in time, you'll say that somebody has andropause.
And what are the challenges associated with menopause and andropause?
The main cause of menopause will be the decline in estrogen levels. Basically, the ovaries cease to function. Estrogen has a lot of functions in the human body, from the brain to the heart to the muscles, everywhere. So more than 80% of ladies who have menopause will have the classical hot flashes. They will have issues with the sleep disturbance, mood changes. They are prone to develop cardiovascular disorders. They are prone to having a condition we call osteoporosis, which can predispose them to getting fractures. On the other side, andropause, mainly due to the decline in testosterone level, what you'll see is more often than not, the symptoms will be sexual in nature, low libido. Some will lose hair. Some will also start losing muscle bulk, among other symptoms.
Dr. Gwako, is it possible for a woman to enter menopause and return to her menstrual period as usual?
A few ladies will start having what you'll consider to be normal menses after menopause. However, clinically, we don't consider that normal. We call it postmenopausal bleeding. It could be physiological, but it could also be one of the earliest signs of gynecological malignancies, like ovarian cancer, endometrial cancer, and cervical cancer. So for anybody who has gone into menopause, starting to have postmenopausal bleeding, we advise that they have to seek medical advice so that they're investigated as to the cause of that bleeding. So yes, it can occur, but it's not considered normal.
And what advice do you give people when they enter menopause and andropause?
It is a normal physiological process. So for menopause, what is known is that 100% of women will go through it if they live to reach that age. For andropause, it affects a small proportion of men. As of now, as I said, it's controversial. So what we advise for women who go into menopause, they don't have to suffer the symptoms of menopause. About 20% of women will actually have very severe symptoms, but fortunately, there is a cure. They can be put on hormonal replacement therapy that can reverse up to 80–90% of the symptoms. It can also prevent them from getting the cardiovascular complications. It can prevent them from getting osteoporosis and the fractures that we talked about. For men, also when they notice the decline in muscle bulk, libido, and all the other signs of andropause, we also encourage them to seek medical advice.
Thank you, Doctor, for your insight. Dr. George Gwako from Galax Gynocare in Nairobi. Back to you, Esther.
Thank you very much, Mkamiti, for a very informative health report today. Join Mkamiti right here on Africa 54 on Tuesdays. And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.